The land deed hit the table like a gunshot, and every man in that cramped courthouse office went silent. Josephine Yates stood in the center of the room, her dark eyes cutting through the haze of pipe smoke and morning dust, her jaw set in a way that could have stopped a stampede cold. She was a widow of 8 months, a woman in black who had walked 4 miles through pre-dawn mud to be here, and she had absolutely no intention of leaving without what belonged to her. Harlan Breckett, the county land commissioner, sat behind his wide desk with his thick fingers laced together across his belly, and he looked at her the way men in that county had always looked at Josephine Yates, like she was a problem that needed politely redirecting rather than a person who deserved answering. "Mrs. Yates," he said, his voice carrying all the patience of a man who did not feel particularly patient. "The records clearly show that the eastern parcel of the Yates property, all 412 acres of it, was transferred to the Rock Creek Cattle Company in an agreement signed and registered on the 14th of March. That is what the ledger says." "That is what the ledger has always said." "No," Josephine said. The single word dropped into that room like a stone into still water, and the ripples went everywhere. She reached into the worn leather satchel at her side and withdrew a folded document, handwritten, dense with precise script, and she set it open on the desk in front of Harlan Breckett with a care that was somehow more frightening than if she had slammed it down. "It is not what the ledger has always said," she told him, her voice low and precise as a surgeon's blade. "Because I have the copy I made myself in my own hand of every transaction recorded in this office that touched my husband's land. I made it 3 years ago when my husband was still living, and I had reason to distrust the security of official documents in this county. I have every entry, every date, every witness signature, and the eastern parcel appears nowhere in those recordings as transferred property. Someone switched your ledger overnight, Mr. Breckett, and I can prove it." The silence that followed was not the silence of disbelief. It was the silence of men who suddenly understood they were standing on very thin ground. Clement Watkins was standing near the back wall of that office. He was there because Harlan Breckett had sent for him that morning, told him to come by and collect the paperwork that would make the eastern parcel officially the property of Rock Creek Cattle Company, a company in which Clement himself held a partial stake through a contract that had seemed, until this exact moment, entirely legitimate. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going silver at the temples and hands that had worked cattle for 20 years and showed every day of it. He had ridden hard to get here before anyone else could arrive and complicate things. He had not expected Josephine Yates. He had heard of her in the abstract way a man hears of a situation without fully reckoning with the people inside of it. He had known her husband, Robert Yates, had done business with him twice before Robert's death from a fever the previous October. He had assumed the widow would be managed through proper channels. He had assumed wrong. Clement watched her lay that handwritten document on the desk, watched the commissioner's face go pale as schoolroom chalk, and felt something shift uneasily in his chest that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the sudden, startling recognition that this woman was not going to lose. And that meant he was on the wrong side of something. He had not known it until this moment. That was what he would tell himself later, when he was riding back alone under a sky full of hard western stars. He had not known. The question that would trouble his sleep for weeks to come was whether that was truly an excuse. But that is getting ahead of the story, and the story needs to be told from the beginning to be understood properly. Josephine Yates had come to the town of Calla Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, newly married to Robert Yates, a cattleman of middling prosperity and genuine good character, who loved his land with a devotion he was never quite able to extend to his paperwork. Robert was a man of big ambitions and moderate organizational skill, and he had recognized early in their marriage that Josephine possessed in spectacular abundance the precise qualities he himself lacked. She was methodical, she was brilliant with figures. She had grown up in Abilene as the daughter of a bookkeeper, had spent her childhood in the back office of her father's accounting firm, learning the shape of numbers and the language of legal documents the way other girls learned needlework and hymns. By the time she married Robert Yates, Josephine could read a land title deed faster and more accurately than most county clerks. She could spot an irregularity in a financial record at 50 paces. She kept her own ledgers, parallel to any official recordings, with a meticulous consistency that her husband sometimes found endearing and occasionally found unnerving. "Josie," he had said to her once in the 3rd year of their marriage, watching her transcribing another stack of county documents by lamplight, "what do you expect to find in all that paper?" "I do not know yet," she had answered him without looking up, "but if something is ever hidden in it, I will find it." She had smiled at him then, and he had shaken his head fondly, and that had been the end of it. She kept her records. He ran his cattle. They were not a grand romance. Robert was a gentle, practical, decent man who showed his love in steady reliability rather than passionate declarations. But they were a good partnership, and Josephine had been content in it. Robert died in October of 1878, 5 days after a fever took hold of him in the way that fevers sometimes did on the frontier, sudden and merciless, and leaving no room for argument. He was 41 years old. Josephine was 32. They had no children, only the land. The land was considerable. Robert Yates had built his ranch through 8 years of careful accumulation, purchasing parcels as neighboring settlers gave up and moved on. And at the time of his death, the Yates property encompassed just under 900 acres of good grass with reliable water access, a solid ranch house, 2 working barns, and a bunkhouse that currently housed 3 hired hands who had stayed on out of loyalty and the practical understanding that they had nowhere better to be. Josephine buried her husband, mourned him in the real and private way she did everything, and then got back to work. She was not a woman who found meaning in prolonged grief. She found meaning in action. She had learned the cattle operation from Robert over their years together, consulted with her hired hands, a weathered older man named Prentice, his nephew Cole, and a quiet Tejano cowboy named Esteban who had been with the ranch longer than any of them and made arrangements to continue running the Yates operation through the following season. She was capable of it. She proved this consistently through the autumn and into the winter. She made decisions. She did the accounts. She kept her parallel records as she had always done, because the habit was too deeply ingrained to abandon and because, with Robert gone, the impulse to document everything felt less like caution and more like necessity. It was in January of 1879 that things began to feel wrong. It started with small things. A surveyor she did not recognize riding the fence lines of the eastern parcel, the most valuable section of her land, well-watered and lying adjacent to the main cattle trail. When she rode out to question him, he claimed to be doing routine county work, gave her a card with an official-looking seal, and departed quickly. She noted his name and the date in her ledger. Then there was a letter from a man named Gerald Thorne, who identified himself as the legal counsel for the Rock Creek Cattle Company, inquiring about her interest in discussing a voluntary transfer arrangement for certain portions of the Yates property. She wrote back declining to discuss any such arrangement and received no reply. Then, in early February, Prentice came to her with the information that riders from Rock Creek had been spotted on the eastern parcel 3 nights running, and that someone had moved several of her fence stakes. Josephine did not panic. She was not built for panic. Instead, she rode into Calla Creek, went directly to the county land commissioner's office, and asked to review the official recordings for all Yates property transactions. Harlan Breckett showed her the ledger, somewhat reluctantly, and she reviewed it carefully. Everything was in order. The ledger matched her own private records precisely. She thanked the commissioner, returned home, and began preparing for what she suspected was coming. She made a fresh, complete copy of every Yates-related entry in the county ledger, directly from her own records which she knew to be accurate, and she annotated it with dates and specifics that would only be available to someone who had been in that office at the time of original recording. She kept this document in a sealed oilskin packet in the locked strongbox beneath her bedroom floorboards, the same strongbox where Robert had kept his original land patents, signed by the Federal Land Office and bearing seals that could not be forged without considerable effort. She had not known, then, exactly what trap was being laid for her. She had known only that it was coming, that it involved the eastern parcel, and that whoever was behind it was patient and organized. Those qualities she recognized. She shared them. Clement Watkins had come to Calla Creek the previous year, in the spring of 1878, almost simultaneously with the Yateses. He was from the hill country of central Texas, the youngest of three brothers who had divided their father's modest spread among themselves and found it insufficient. Clement had the restlessness that comes from knowing you are capable of more than your circumstances have yet allowed, and he had the work ethic and the cattle knowledge to back that restlessness up. He had arrived in this county with his own small stake and his own small herd, leased grazing land from a neighboring rancher, and spent the year building. He was not a dishonest man. This was important to understand. He was a man of genuine integrity who had made the mistake of aligning himself with people whose integrity did not match his own, because the financial arrangement had seemed solid, and because he had not looked close enough at the details. Gerald Thorne, the Rock Creek lawyer, had approached Clement in the fall of 1878, just after Robert Yates' death, with a proposition. Rock Creek was expanding operations in the county. They needed experienced cattlemen with established local presence. They were offering equity stakes to select partners who would bring their own herds under the Rock Creek umbrella and share in the consolidated profits. The eastern parcel of the Yates property, Thorne had explained, was being acquired through a negotiated purchase agreement with the estate, and once that land was consolidated into Rock Creek's holdings, the grazing capacity of the whole operation would increase substantially. Clement had asked questions. He had done what he believed was due diligence. He had reviewed the documents Thorne showed him, which indicated a purchase agreement signed by Robert Yates before his death. He had not thought to question whether Robert Yates had actually signed such a thing, because men signed agreements with cattle companies all the time, and a man dying of fever might indeed have made arrangements for his land that he hadn't fully discussed with his wife. He had signed the partnership agreement. He had spent 4 months building his contribution to the Rock Creek operation, running his cattle on leased land, watching the eastern parcel continue to be occupied by Yates cattle, noting with some unease that the widow did not seem to be operating like a woman whose land had been purchased. But Thorne had explained this too. The widow was being difficult. There were legal processes underway. Everything would be resolved through proper channels. Clement had believed this because he had wanted to believe it. That was the truth he would eventually have to sit with. The morning of the courthouse confrontation, Clement had ridden into Calla Creek expecting routine paperwork. He had found instead a woman with dark eyes and a handwritten ledger copy that was dismantling, piece by piece, everything Gerald Thorne had told him. He listened to Josephine Yates present her case to Harlan Breckett with the precision of a woman who had been preparing for this exact moment for months, and with each word she spoke, the picture assembled itself more clearly and more damningly in his mind. The purchase agreement, allegedly signed by Robert Yates. Robert Yates had been dead 3 weeks before the date listed on it. The county ledger entry showing the transfer, Josephine's copy, made from the same ledger at an earlier date, showed no such entry. The surveyor's work on the eastern parcel paid for by Rock Creek, not by any county authority. The fence stake relocation, preparing the ground for a takeover that was supposed to look administrative and legitimate. Someone had switched the official ledger. Someone had forged a dead man's signature. Someone had constructed an elaborate theft of a widow's most valuable land, and they had done it so carefully and so systematically that they had nearly succeeded. Clement Watkins stood at the back of that office and felt the full weight of what he had participated in, however unknowingly, descend on him like a collapsing barn roof. "Mr. Breckett," Josephine said, her voice still steady, still precise, "I am prepared to request a formal review by the State Land Office. I am also prepared to have my copy of these records examined by 3 independent assessors of my own choosing, 2 of whom are former county clerks from neighboring jurisdictions who can speak to the formatting and dating conventions used in this specific office during the period in question. I have already sent letters to all 3 of them." She paused. "I sent those letters 2 weeks ago, in anticipation of this meeting." Breckett's face had gone from pale to a specific shade of gray that Clement associated with men who were calculating exactly how much trouble they were in. "Mrs. Yates," Breckett began. "The correct form of address, Mr. Breckett, is Miss Yates now," Josephine said quietly. "My late husband has been gone for 8 months, but what you call me is considerably less important than what you are going to do about this ledger." It was at this moment that Clement Watkins stepped away from the back wall and walked forward. He did not fully plan it. The decision arrived in his body before his mind caught up to it, the way certain necessary things happen, not through deliberation, but through the sudden, undeniable clarity of knowing what is right. "Commissioner," he said. Every head in the room turned. Clement reached the desk and stood beside Josephine, not touching her, but deliberately placing himself in the same front-facing position, and he looked at Harlan Breckett with the steady gaze of a man who has made a choice and intends to stand behind it. "I am Clement Watkins," he said. "I hold a partial equity stake in Rock Creek Cattle Company through a partnership agreement I signed in November of last year, on the basis of representations made to me by Gerald Thorne regarding this property. Those representations, as Mrs. Yates' documents suggest, were false." He drew a breath. "I am withdrawing from that agreement effective today, and I am willing to submit my own copy of the partnership documents, including the initial proposal Thorne presented me, which included the supposed purchase agreement with the Yates estate, for review by whatever authority investigates this matter." The silence this time had a different quality. It was the silence of the walls of something collapsing. Josephine Yates turned and looked at him. He had not expected her to look at him like that. Not with gratitude exactly, but with the kind of careful, precise assessment that a very intelligent person gives to something unexpected and potentially significant. Like she was reading him the way she read a document, looking for the date and the signatures and the evidence of whether it could be trusted. He met her gaze directly and held it because he had nothing to hide from her, not anymore. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "But you will." It was not a line. He was not a man who dealt in lines. It was simply what he believed to be true, said plainly, in the manner of a man who had recently rediscovered his own capacity for honesty. The investigation into the Rock Creek land fraud took 6 weeks. It was conducted by a state-appointed examiner named Hollis Garrett, who arrived from Austin with 3 assistants, and the look of a man who had seen this particular variety of frontier corruption before and was professionally tired of it. He interviewed everyone. He examined every document. He spent 4 hours with Josephine's handwritten ledger copy and emerged from that session visibly impressed in the way that specialists become impressed when they encounter work that meets their own standards. During those 6 weeks, Josephine ran her ranch. She did not pause, she did not wait, she did not suspend normal operations on the possibility that the investigation might resolve favorably. She managed her cattle, oversaw the spring branding, and negotiated a fair rate for her first major cattle sale of the season entirely on her own terms. She also, almost against her will, began to know Clement Watkins. He came to her ranch 3 days after the courthouse meeting, riding in through the front gate at a mid-morning hour that was neither too early to be intrusive nor too late to be deliberately casual. He was wearing a clean shirt and he had left his gun belt at whatever was serving as his current bunkhouse. He held his hat in his hand, which Josephine noticed. She was in the near corral working with a young quarter horse that had recently developed a fear of sudden movement, and she did not stop working when he came to the fence rail. She kept her hands slow and her voice low and her attention on the animal, because interrupting the work would have set them back, and she did not interrupt her work for anyone. "You can wait," she told him without looking at him, "or you can ride back to wherever you came from." He waited. He leaned on the fence rail and watched her work, and he was quiet about it, which she appreciated. Men who felt compelled to fill silence with words generally did so because they were uncomfortable with what silence might reveal. Clement Watkins seemed comfortable with silence. She noted that too. The young horse took the better part of an hour to settle properly, and when it did, Josephine came to the fence and looked at Clement Watkins at close range for the first time. He was older than she had registered in the chaos of the courthouse. She put him in his early 40s, perhaps 42 or 43. He was deeply weathered in the way of men who lived outside, with lines at the corners of his eyes that had been put there by years of squinting into southwestern sun, and his hands resting on the fence rail were large and rough-knuckled and competent-looking. He was not a pretty man. He was the kind of man that the frontier built, enduring and honest-looking in the specific way that came from having had his dishonesty recently confronted and rejected. "You came to explain yourself," she said. "I came to apologize," he said, "and to offer whatever I can toward making this right." Josephine looked at him for a long moment. "How much did you know?" she asked. "Not enough," he said, "and I should have known more. That is the truth I have been making my peace with." She considered this. It was not nothing, that answer. A lesser man would have constructed more elaborate defenses. "What you did in Brackett's office," she said carefully, "that was your equity stake in Rock Creek. You surrendered a significant financial position." "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her directly. "Because it was built on a lie and I didn't want it anymore." Josephine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come inside. I'll make coffee. We can discuss what you know about Thorne and what I need from you for the investigation." It was not warmth, exactly, but it was an opening, and Clement Watkins was a man who understood the value of ground that had been offered rather than taken. Over the 6 weeks of the investigation, Clement came to the Yates ranch often. At first entirely on investigation business. He had useful information about Rock Creek's operations, about the men Thorne had recruited, about the financial structure of the scheme that had multiple other potential victims beyond Josephine. He wrote up statements, signed affidavits, rode with Garrett's assistants to identify locations and corroborate timelines. He was methodical and precise about it, which was not what Josephine had expected from a man who had, until recently, been the opposition. She watched him work during those weeks, and she revised her assessment of him continuously, and precisely the way she revised her ledger entries, not erasing what had been there before, but adding to it, building a more complete picture. He was not careless. That had been her initial assumption, that he had partnered with Thorne out of the laziness that led men to trust surfaces rather than digging into substance. But watching him move through the investigation process, watching the thoroughness he brought to reconstructing what had actually happened versus what Thorne had told him had happened, she understood that he had not been careless so much as he had been deceived by someone who was very good at deception. There was a difference, not a complete absolution, but a genuine difference. He was also, she discovered, unexpectedly good with cattle. This should not have been relevant information. It was not relevant information. And yet she found herself noting it, watching from the ranch house window one afternoon when he had arrived to find Prentice and Cole dealing with a fence emergency near the north pasture, and had simply dismounted, rolled up his sleeves, and helped without being asked. He knew what he was doing. He worked alongside her hands with the easy efficiency of a man who had done this specific labor all his life, who did not need to be directed or organized or made to understand what the task required. Esteban, who trusted almost no one and communicated his opinions in looks rather than words, watched Clement Watkins work the fence line and then looked at Josephine with an expression that said, plainly, that this man was all right. Josephine valued Esteban's judgment considerably. She always had. The investigation resolved in the final week of March, 1879, with findings that were about as damning as findings get. Gerald Thorne had orchestrated the whole scheme, the forged signature, the ledger switch, which had been accomplished through a bribed county clerk's assistant who had subsequently departed the jurisdiction, and the manufactured legal pathway designed to strip 3 widows and 2 elderly bachelor ranchers of their most valuable parcels. Josephine's case was the most documented and the most immediately actionable, largely because of her handwritten ledger copy, which Examiner Garrett described in his official report as an exceptionally detailed and legally persuasive private record that provided the evidentiary foundation for this entire investigation. Thorne fled before he could be arrested, which was unfortunately common in those years and on those frontiers. But the fraud was formally documented, the ledger was restored to its accurate condition, and every affected property was officially confirmed in its rightful ownership. The bribed clerk's assistant was identified by name and a warrant issued. Harlan Breckett, who it turned out had known more about the irregularity than he had admitted to in that first meeting, resigned his position and left Calla Creek within the week. His departure was watched from the door of the general store by approximately a third of the town's population, most of them quietly satisfied. On the evening that Examiner Garrett delivered the final determination to Josephine at her ranch house, Clement Watkins was there. He had ridden over to help Prentice with a calving situation that had turned complicated, and he was still in the barn when Garrett's wagon came up the road. He came out of the barn when the wagon left, saw Josephine standing on the porch in the late evening light holding the official papers, and walked toward her. She heard his boots on the porch steps and turned to look at him. There was dust on his shirt from the barn work, and there was something on his face that she had not seen before, or perhaps she had seen it and not allowed herself to name it. He looked at her with a directness that was different from investigation directness, from business directness. He looked at her like a man who was allowing himself to look. "It's over," he asked. "It's over," she said. "The eastern parcel is confirmed mine, all of it." He nodded slowly, and she could see him processing something, processing it and deciding to say it the way honest men decide things. "I'm glad," he said. "Josephine." He used her name deliberately without the Mrs. or the Miss, and it landed differently than any version of her name had landed in a long time. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Stay for supper." He stayed for supper. And supper became the first of many evenings at the Yates ranch house table, because once Clement Watkins had been invited, once the door had been opened that specific inch, Josephine found she had no particular desire to close it. She was not naive about what this was. She was 32 years old, and she had been married, and she was widowed, and she had spent the last 6 months fighting a legal battle for her survival. She was not a girl who confused gratitude for affection or proximity for connection. She knew what she felt, and she examined it with the same precision she brought to everything else. She felt, when Clement was in the room, something she had not felt in a considerable time and perhaps had never felt with quite this particular quality. She felt like someone who might be fully seen, not just adequately appreciated. Robert had loved her. She believed this truly. But Robert had loved her in the way a man loves a capable partner, valued and relied upon and essentially peripheral to the deep center of his attention, which had always been the land itself. Clement looked at her differently. He looked at her like she was the center. She did not rush toward this. She was not built for rushing. She observed it and she thought about it, and she kept her distance and her careful self-possession, while Clement came to the ranch for supper, and then came to help with the spring work that needed extra hands, and then came one afternoon simply to ask if she wanted to ride the fence line with him, and check on the eastern parcel markers, since the new ones had recently been installed. She had said yes to that last thing without any deliberation at all, which told her something. They rode out together on a blue-skied April afternoon, the kind of afternoon that makes you understand why people came to this particular piece of Texas and kept coming back. The light was gold and the grass was green after the winter, and the cattle moved peacefully on the far side of the pasture, and the new fence stakes stood clean and straight along the borders that the fraud had tried to erase. Josephine rode a gray mare named December, who she had trained herself and who responded to the lightest signal of knee or hand. Clement rode his bay gelding, whose name was Practical, which Josephine found quietly amusing and which said something true about Clement's character. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the way people ride together when they are comfortable enough not to need words. Josephine checked the fence stakes as they went, making small notes in the leather-bound notebook she carried in her coat pocket. Clement watched this operation with the attention of someone who was genuinely interested in what he was watching. "You keep notes even on a fence inspection," he observed. "I keep notes on everything," she said. "Is that how you knew to make the ledger copy?" "That habit," she considered the question. "Partly," she said, "partly it was my father. He always said that a record not kept is a story that can be changed by whoever wants to change it." She paused. He was an accountant. He had seen what happens when the only version of a transaction exists in one place controlled by one person. "Wise man," Clement said. "He was," she agreed. "He died when I was 24. I think about what he taught me every single day." Clement was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him deciding something again, the way she had begun to recognize when he was making those internal decisions. "My father taught me cattle," he said. "Not much else, to be honest. He wasn't a man who put great stock in education." A pause. "I sometimes wonder what kind of man I would have been if I had learned to think the way you think." Josephine looked at him sideways, curious. "The way I think? Systematically," he said. "Like everything is a document to be read rather than a situation to be managed." "They are the same thing," she said. "That is what my father was actually teaching me. Every situation is a document if you read it carefully enough." Clement was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "That is the most useful thing anyone has ever said to me." She laughed. It surprised her the laugh came out naturally, without any of the careful control she usually maintained. It was a full, genuine laugh, and the mare under her turned one ear back at it, and when she looked at Clement he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, and then, honestly, "I have not heard you laugh before." "I have not had much occasion for it recently," she said. "No," he agreed. "I suppose not." They rode on. The afternoon was growing warmer. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark was managing an opinion about the quality of the day. "Clement," she said after a while, "why did you stay, after the investigation?" She kept her eyes on the fence line as she said it. "You had finished what you came to make right. You could have gone back to wherever you were going before all this happened." He was quiet for long enough that she glanced at him. His eyes were on the horizon. "I found I didn't want to," he said simply. "Everything I was going toward before is gone now anyway. The Rock Creek arrangement was the financial vehicle for what I was building in this county. Without it, I need to start over." He paused. And starting over in a place where there is something worth staying for seemed considerably more attractive than starting over somewhere there isn't. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the fence line. "Something," she said. "Someone," he corrected quietly. She did not answer that because she was not ready to answer it yet, and he did not press her because he understood. She had come to understand that he understood the difference between saying a true thing aloud and asking someone else to confirm it before they were ready. She respected that about him more than she could easily express. May arrived with its heat and its work and its long evenings, and Clement became a regular presence at the Yates ranch. in a way that the whole county noticed and discussed with the enthusiasm that small frontier towns reserve for anything more interesting than cattle prices. Josephine was largely indifferent to the discussion. She had never structured her behavior around other people's opinions, and she was not going to begin now. Prentice, who was old enough to have watched many situations develop from their first seeds, said nothing to Josephine directly, but began making 2 extra cups of coffee every morning on the assumption that Clement would be there, and was correct more often than not. Cole, Prentice's nephew, who was 23 and romantically optimistic by nature, was openly delighted by the whole situation, and expressed this by being unnecessarily helpful whenever Clement was on the property, showing him where things were kept and how Josephine liked things done, as though facilitating a domestic integration rather than simply answering practical questions. Esteban watched everything and said nothing, as was his nature. One evening in mid-May, Josephine and Clement were sitting on the front porch after supper, as had become their habit, the western sky going through its nightly performance of golds and reds, and Josephine had brought out the land map she was working with to show Clement something she had been thinking about regarding the spring grazing rotation. This was how their evenings often went, beginning with the practical, the cattle and the land, and then ranging outward from there into whatever else presented itself. She had discovered that Clement was genuinely curious about most things, that he listened with his full attention rather than waiting for the pause where he could say his piece, and that he asked good questions. These were not qualities she had taken for granted in men, because they were not common. She was spreading the map on the porch rail between them, pointing to the section of the eastern pasture where she thought the water access could be improved, and she was explaining the logic of it, the drainage patterns, the seasonal variations in the creek, the carrying capacity of the grass relative to the herd size she was planning, and she was deep in the explanation, focused on the map, when she realized that Clement had gone very still beside her. She looked up. He was looking at her, not at the map. He had been looking at her, and the expression on his face was the one she had been refusing to name since the afternoon on the fence line, and she understood in that moment that she could not continue to refuse to name it. "Josephine," he said. "I know," she said. She looked at the map. She was honest enough to not pretend she didn't. "I know what you are going to say." And, he asked. She was quiet for a moment. The sky was doing something extraordinary with its reds, and she watched it and let herself feel fully what she had been carefully measuring and categorizing and holding at a productive distance for 2 months. "And I think," she said slowly, "that it would be unwise to make any decisions about this before we are sure of what we are deciding." "I am sure," he said. "I know you are," she said. "I am not as quick as you are about some things." "You are quicker than me about most things," he said, and there was a warmth in it, a genuine admiration without any resentment, the kind of acknowledgement that she had rarely received from men about her own capacities. She looked at him. "Give me time," she said. "You have all the time there is," he said. She believed him, that was the thing. She looked at him in the red evening light, and she believed him completely. And that belief was itself a significant data point in the accounting she was conducting on this particular situation. She gave herself another 3 weeks. She was nothing if not thorough. The determination she arrived at the end of those 3 weeks, was this. She was in love with Clement Watkins in the very specific way that a woman who has been completely self-sufficient falls in love. Not from need, not from dependence, not from the relief of having someone to lean on, but from the much rarer experience of finding someone whose presence made the already sufficient life feel genuinely better. She told him this on a Sunday afternoon, when he was in the near corral looking at her young quarter horse, the one she had been training when he first came to apologize. The horse had made significant progress, and she had been demonstrating this for him, running the animal through a set of signals, and when she finished and came to the fence he was looking at her with such transparent appreciation. For the horsemanship, for the patience the training represented, for the skill that had brought this nervous young animal to such calm and responsive capability, that she stopped with her hands on the fence rail and looked back at him and simply said, "I have made my decision." He went very still in the way she had come to love, that particular quality of complete attention. "I am in love with you," she said. "I am saying it plainly because I am a plain-speaking woman, and I see no virtue in being oblique about things I know to be true." Clement Watkins, who was a man who had survived hard winters and difficult cattle drives, and the particular shame of discovering he had been used as an instrument of injustice, who had built and lost and rebuilt, and who had not flinched from any of it, looked at her across the fence rail, and his face did something she had not seen it do before. It went soft in a way that was completely undefended, open in the way of a man who has been given something he was not entirely sure he deserved and is too honest to pretend otherwise. He came around the end of the fence rail and he stood in front of her, and he put his hands on her face with the same gentleness he used with frightened cattle, and his voice, when he found it, was quieter than she had ever heard it. "Josephine Yates," he said, "you are the most remarkable person I have ever met in my life." "I know," she said, because she had a realistic assessment of her own capabilities, and then because she also had a sense of humor and he had come to know it. "Tell me something new." He laughed, and then he kissed her, and it was unhurried and sure and completely without performance. The way everything Clement Watkins did was unhurried and sure, and Josephine, who had not let herself be kissed by anyone since Robert's death and had not been kissed like this at any point she could accurately remember, found that she did not want it to stop. The quarter horse behind her nudged the back of her coat with its nose. They broke apart laughing. "Even the horse," Clement said. "She has opinions about interruptions," Josephine said. "We have that in common." Summer came to the Texas Hill Country the way it always did, suddenly and completely, the heat arriving like a verdict with no appeal process. Josephine ran her cattle through the long days with Prentice and Cole and Esteban, and Clement worked his own rebuilt small operation from the leased land he had arranged through a neighboring rancher, coming to the Yates ranch most evenings. The arrangement was practical and proper, and everyone in Calla Creek understood exactly what it was and found it simultaneously scandalous and romantic, depending on their personal constitution. Josephine was unbothered. Clement was unbothered. They had both long since stopped arranging their lives around the opinions of people who did not have to live those lives. He proposed to her on an August evening, standing in the kitchen of the ranch house while she was reviewing the summer cattle accounts, and he was making himself useful with the supper dishes, which he had developed the habit of doing, because he had observed early on that Josephine found the domestic tasks less interesting than the accounting, and so he had quietly redistributed the labor along lines of preference without making any ceremony of it. He put down the dish he was drying and he turned to her, and she looked up from the ledger because she had registered the quality of the silence, and he said, "Marry me." It was not flowery. Clement Watkins was not a flowery man. Josephine closed the ledger. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight, and she felt the same certainty she felt about her records, not the brittle certainty of wishful thinking but the solid certainty of verified fact. "Yes," she said, "on the condition that this ranch remains in my name and my management." "Obviously," he said, as though it had never occurred to him that this would be otherwise, which she believed it had not. "And that my records keep," she said, "all of them." "I would not have it any other way," he said. "Then yes," she said again. "Absolutely yes." He crossed the kitchen to her in 2 strides and kissed her with considerably more conviction than the first time, and the ledger fell off the table and neither of them picked it up until the following morning. They were married in October of 1879, exactly 1 year after Robert Yates' death, at the small church on the eastern edge of Calla Creek. It was a quiet ceremony by frontier standards, which still meant approximately 40 people in the pews, because the town had a significant investment in this particular resolution, and no one wanted to miss it. Prentice stood up with Clement. Esteban, who could be moved to formality for genuine occasions, wore a clean jacket, and kept an expression throughout the ceremony that Josephine recognized as his version of emotional. Cole cried openly, which he would deny for the next several years to anyone who mentioned it. The Reverend was a practical man who kept the vows brief and sincere, and did not spend excessive time on scripture, which Josephine appreciated. She had worn her best dress, which was a deep blue that she had purchased in Abilene and saved for occasions of genuine significance, and she had put her dark hair up in a way that she almost never bothered with on ordinary days. Clement looked at her when she came down the aisle of that small church, and the expression on his face was one that she committed to her memory with the precision she committed everything to memory. It was the expression of a man who could not believe his good fortune, and was not going to diminish it by pretending to be anything other than exactly as happy as he was. She took his hands at the altar, and they looked at each other directly, the way they had always looked at each other, without apology or performance. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the ranch that lasted until well past midnight, with a fiddle player from 3 farms over and someone's good whiskey, and enough food to serve the county twice over. The night was warm enough for it, the September air carrying just the beginning of its autumn edge, and the stars over Texas were doing their customary brilliant work overhead. Josephine danced, which she rarely did, because she did genuinely love dancing and had simply had insufficient occasion for it in recent years. Clement was a competent dancer in the way of frontier-raised men, not graceful exactly but musical in his sense of rhythm, and they danced together twice before he passed her off to Prentice for a reel, and went a talk to the neighboring ranchers who had come with their congratulations and their carefully disguised land business inquiries, which Clement deflected cheerfully. She watched him across the yard, her ranch, her land, talking with the other men, at ease in the social landscape, the way he was at ease in the physical one, and she felt a quality of happiness that she had not expected to find again in her life, and received it therefore with all the clarity of a woman who knows the value of what she is holding. They built what they built together, which was the real story, not the drama of the fraud in the courthouse and the handwritten ledger, though those things had made the rest possible. The real story was the long, ongoing construction of a shared life between 2 people who each brought their whole capable selves to it, and found that the combination was considerably greater than the sum of its parts. In the winter of that first year of marriage, Clement made a business decision that turned out to be a significant one. He had been considering options since dissolving the Rock Creek partnership, weighing the various paths available to a man rebuilding from scratch in this particular part of Texas, with this particular set of skills. He came to Josephine with his thinking laid out, his small herd, the leased land situation, the options for expansion, and they spent an entire evening at the kitchen table going through the numbers, her ledger open, his ideas spoken aloud, the 2 of them working through the logic of it with the combined efficiency of their 2 very different and very complementary intelligences. What they determined was this: Clement would sell his current herd at spring prices, use the proceeds to pay off his remaining lease obligations, and join his operation formally to the Yates ranch as a working partner. The land remained legally Josephine's, as agreed. But the combined operation would be considerably larger, considerably more viable, and would allow them to begin acquiring additional cattle at favorable terms through connections Clement had built in the industry. Josephine's accounting expertise would handle the financial side. Clement's cattle knowledge and labor would handle the operational side. It was an efficient arrangement that also happened to be the life they both wanted, which made it, in Josephine's assessment, optimal. The spring of 1880 was the best they had seen in the county in 5 years. Rain came at the right intervals and the grass came up thick, and the calf crop was excellent. Clement and Josephine rode the property together in the mornings more often than not, making decisions jointly, covering the land that Josephine had fought for and preserved, and that now had a second pair of capable hands to help manage it. One morning in April, riding back from checking the Eastern parcel, which Josephine always checked personally, a habit she had maintained since the fraud attempt, she told Clement that she thought she might be expecting. She said it plainly, in the matter-of-fact tone she used for significant information, because dramatic revelations were not her style. Clement's horse stopped walking. This was not a thing Clement had asked it to do. He looked at her. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I am not certain of anything I cannot document," she said, "but the evidence is persuasive." He reached across the distance between their horses and took her hand, and he held it with both of his, and he looked at her with that open, undefended expression that she had collected as carefully as she collected data. "Josephine," he said, "do not make it overly dramatic," she told him. "I'm not making it dramatic at all," he said. "I am simply very, very happy." She squeezed his hands. "As am I," she said. Their son was born in November of 1880, and they named him Robert Clement Watkins, combining the name of the man who had first built this land with the name of the man who would help to keep it and grow it. He was a substantial baby with his father's dark hair, and, in Josephine's informed opinion, already showing signs of an analytical temperament. She kept meticulous notes on this observation. Clement sat beside the bed the night Robert was born, and looked at his son with the same quality of open happiness he brought to everything good in his life, and then he looked at Josephine with an expression that combined profound love and profound respect in a ratio that she found, in her honest assessment, entirely correct. "You are extraordinary," he told her. "I have just demonstrated that this is factually true," she agreed, tired but entirely herself. He laughed and leaned forward, and kissed her forehead with a tenderness that she stored in her memory, alongside the other significant data of her life. Life on the Yates-Watkins ranch, for that is what it became known as in the county, informally first, and then by general convention, settled into the good rhythms of a prosperous frontier operation run by people who knew what they were doing. Josephine managed the accounts and the legal business and the records, as she always had, and she continued maintaining her parallel documentation system as a matter of course, because the fraud had taught her what she had already believed but now knew with the force of experience, that the only records you can fully trust are the ones you have kept yourself. Harlan Breckett had been replaced by a new commissioner named Ellery, who was considerably more scrupulous, partly because the entire county was watching county land records with increased vigilance after the Rock Creek affair, and partly because Josephine Yates, she kept the name professionally, Mrs. Watkins privately, had established herself as a significant watchdog presence in county record-keeping matters, and no one with good sense wanted to be on the wrong side of her attention. She had, in fact, begun consulting informally with other women in the county who had land business to manage, and found themselves uncertain of their documentation. This was not an official capacity, but it was a real one, and it grew organically from the recognition that her skills were valuable beyond her own operation, and that the injustice of the Rock Creek scheme had not been an anomaly. It had been a specifically targeted exploitation of widows and isolated landowners who were believed to be either ignorant or incapable of defending themselves. Josephine was aware that many of them were neither ignorant nor incapable, only unequipped with the specific knowledge that could protect them. She began remedying this where she could, quietly and practically, which was entirely consistent with her character. Clement supported this work with the straightforward support he brought to everything she did, not with fanfare or excessive commentary, but with the practical adjustments that made it possible. If she needed to ride into town for a meeting with another landowning woman, the ranch was managed. If she needed the evening hours for correspondence rather than supper preparation, supper was handled. He had never treated her capabilities as a novelty or her independence as a problem to be accommodated rather than a reality to be lived alongside. She found this, consistently and repeatedly, to be one of the things she loved most about him. In the spring of 1882, Examiner Hollis Garrett came back through Calla Creek on a different investigation, a different county, a similar scheme, and he needed to review documentation from the earlier Rock Creek case. He came to the Yates-Watkins ranch because Josephine's records were, as he had noted in his original report, the most complete available, and spent an afternoon with her going through the documentation. When he left, he said to her directly, "Mrs. Yates, in 15 years of this work, I have encountered perhaps 3 private individuals who maintained records of this quality. You saved not just your own land but the entire framework of this investigation. The other ranchers who recovered their property recovered it because of what you documented." Josephine thanked him. After he had ridden away, she stood on the porch for a moment with the particular quietness of someone processing something that matters. Clement came up behind her and put a hand on her shoulder, and she reached up and put her hand over his, and they stood there together in the afternoon light looking out at the land. "He's right, you know," Clement said. "I kept the records because it was the correct thing to do," she said. "That's what makes you right," he said. She turned to look at him, and he was looking at her with that expression, the one that she had catalogued and knew completely, and which never ceased to be exactly what she needed it to be. And she took his face in her hands and kissed him in the afternoon on the porch of her ranch house. Their daughter was born in the autumn of 1883, and they named her Clara Watkins, which had been Josephine's mother's name, and which suited her from the first day, because Clara arrived in the world with her mother's dark eyes and her father's calm presence, and the particular quality, which Josephine noted with satisfaction, of a person who pays careful attention to everything around her. Robert, who was nearly 3 by then, examined his new sister with the serious consideration of a small person who has recently become aware that the world contains more categories of thing than he had previously catalogued. He was a sociable child, inclined toward the outdoor work, already following Esteban around the corral with his small, serious face and asking questions. Esteban answered every question with patient thoroughness and had developed, it was clear to anyone who watched, a profound affection for both Watkins' children that he expressed through the same eloquent looks and quiet competence with which he expressed everything else. Prentice was getting older, his knees giving him trouble in the cold months, and Clement had quietly increased his compensation and reduced his heavier duties without making a production of it. Prentice accepted this with the dignity of an old cowhand who knows when someone is handling him right. Cole had taken on considerably more responsibility and was developing into a genuinely skilled range manager, which Josephine had noted in her ledger of human assets as a positive development. The ranch grew. Not explosively, Josephine had no interest in the kind of rapid expansion that had driven men like Thorne to their corrupt schemes. She believed in measured growth and sustainable scale, and the operation she and Clement built reflected this. A herd that was consistently well managed, land that was properly cared for, finances that were rigorously documented and honest, and a working environment that treated the people who labored on it with basic fairness. This last point had been a deliberate choice. The exploitation of frontier labor was as common as the exploitation of frontier land, and Josephine had no tolerance for either. Esteban received wages equal to those of the Anglo hands, which was not standard practice in 1879 Texas, and which Josephine had established from the first day she took over ranch management and maintained through every subsequent year. She did not make a speech about it. She simply paid what was fair and kept the records to prove it. She was aware that this was one small correction among many injustices, and she was aware that her ability to make even that small correction came from the privilege of the position she occupied. She held both of these things simultaneously, as she held most true things with clear-eyed honesty and without the comfort of oversimplification. In the summer of 1885, Gerald Thorne was located in New Mexico Territory and extradited back to Texas to face charges. This news reached Calla Creek through the Abilene newspaper, which ran a short piece on the case with a reference to the Rock Creek investigation that had originally exposed the scheme. Josephine read it at breakfast and handed the paper to Clement and went on with her morning. Satisfied, Clement asked. That the law is functioning, she said. Yes. And about Thorne specifically, she considered. Thorne is a symptom, she said. The condition that produced him is what I remain unsatisfied with. The ease with which fraud can be committed against people who are assumed to have no recourse. Clement looked at her over the paper. You have been thinking about this for a while, he said. I have been thinking about it since the courthouse, she said. 6 years ago. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what are you going to do about it? She had already begun to answer that question before he asked it. She had, in fact, been corresponding for the past year with the Texas State Land Commissioner's office about the possibility of formalizing the informal consultation work she had been doing in the county, establishing a documented process by which landowners could verify the accuracy of county records against independent documentation, and by which suspicious discrepancies could be reported to a state-level authority with actual investigative power. This was ambitious for 1885. It was also the kind of thing that, if it were going to happen at all, needed someone who could make the case with ironclad documentation and unassailable precision. It took 3 years. In 1888, the Texas state legislature passed a modest but genuine reform to county land recording requirements, increased documentation standards, mandatory second verification for certain classes of transaction, and a formal complaint pathway to the state land office. It was not everything Josephine had wanted, but it was real and it was lasting, and she had been the primary moving force behind it. Garrett, who had become something approaching a friend through the years of correspondence and the shared commitment to land record integrity, wrote her a letter when the legislation passed. He said, "You turned your own defense into a protection for others. That is the rarest thing." She kept the letter. She kept everything. Clement read it when she showed it to him, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I want you to know something." "Tell me," she said. "The day you laid that ledger copy on Brackett's desk," he said, "I was standing at the back of that room ready to collect papers for a company that had used me to help steal from you. And you stood there and took that whole scheme apart with a document you had made with your own hand in your own time, because you had known something like this might come." He paused. "I have never in my life before or since seen anything that impressed me more deeply." She looked at him. He was not a man who said things like this often, which made the things he said like this land with full weight. "I know," she said quietly. "I saw your face." "Is that what decided you?" he asked, not anxiously, simply curious. "It was contributing evidence," she said. "The decision took somewhat longer." 3 weeks longer, he said. "I am thorough," she said. "You are thorough," he agreed, and reached across and took her hand on the table, the way he had been reaching for her hand for 9 years, always with the same quality of intention. Robert was 8 that year. Clara was 5. And on a warm evening in late summer, the 4 of them sat on the porch while the cattle moved in the distance and the sky went through its nightly extraordinary performance. Robert was telling his father something about the calf he had been assigned to watch over, with the serious urgency of a child who has been given genuine responsibility and is taking it genuinely seriously. Clara was leaning against Josephine's side, half asleep, with her dark eyes fighting to stay open. Josephine looked out at the eastern pasture, at the fence line where the new stakes stood straight and solid, at the grass that was green and the water that ran reliably, and the cattle that moved on her land, confirmed and documented and defended by the work of her own hands and the precision of her own mind. She looked at Clement, who was listening to Robert with the full attention he brought to everything small and significant, and she felt what she always felt when she let herself feel it fully, that the life she had built was the life she had chosen, and it was correct in all its particulars. She had not needed rescuing. She had rescued herself, and the proof was in the handwriting. But she had found, in the man who had stood beside her at the desk and surrendered his stake in the wrong side, something she had not anticipated and could not have planned for. She had found a partner of the specific and precise variety that her life had always lacked, one who met her strength with his own and added to it, who did not require her to be smaller to make room for his presence, who was, when she looked at him in all lights and all seasons, exactly what the evidence indicated him to be: true, steady, and deeply, genuinely hers. In 1891, Josephine Yates Watkins, she had begun, in the most formal professional contexts, using the hyphenated form as a practical acknowledgement of both the person she had been and the person she had become, published, through a small but reputable printer in Austin, a short practical guide to land record documentation for frontier homesteaders. It was 47 pages, written in the clear and precise style that characterized all her work, and it addressed specifically the vulnerabilities that the Rock Creek scheme had exploited, and the methods by which any landowner, regardless of their formal education, could protect themselves through systematic personal documentation. She dedicated it, without sentiment but with complete sincerity, to her father, the accountant who had taught her that a record not kept is a story that can be changed. The guide sold through 4 printings in the first 2 years. She received letters from as far as Kansas and Colorado Territory. Several of those letters were from women in situations not unlike the one she had faced in 1879, and she answered each one personally, with the specific and practical information they needed rather than the general encouragement that was considerably less useful. Clement read the guide when the first copies came from the printer, and he held it in his hands for a long time. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "I think your father would be proud," he said. She had to look away from him for a moment because she agreed and because it moved her in the particular way that the acknowledgement of a person who mattered moved her. "I think so," she said. He set the book carefully on the mantelpiece in the ranch house parlor, in the place of honor usually reserved for things of genuine significance, and it stayed there. Clara, who was 8 by then, and had the reading habit firmly established, read the guide with an intensity that made Josephine quietly pleased. Robert, who was 11 and primarily interested in the cattle and the horses, read the parts about what happened when records were falsified, and declared it the most interesting story he had encountered outside of the dime novels Cole occasionally brought back from town. They were good children. They were real and particular children with their own natures and their own developing capabilities, and watching them grow into those natures was one of the continual surprises of Josephine's life. That children could contain such unexpected specificness, that Robert would turn out to have not just his father's steadiness, but his father's particular quality of full attention, and that Clara would turn out to have not just her mother's precision, but a gift for the horses that exceeded even Josephine's considerable skill with them. This last fact was discovered when Clara, at the age of 10, handled a badly spooked stallion that had thrown 2 of the hands and was causing genuine danger in the corral. By walking into the corral alone and applying a combination of stillness and specific low vocalization that Josephine had never seen before and could not entirely account for. Clement had come running when he heard the commotion and arrived to find Clara standing in the center of the corral with the stallion's nose in her palm, both of them completely calm. He looked at this scene and then looked at Josephine. "She learned that from somewhere," he said. "She invented it," Josephine said. "I have never done it that way." Something moved across his face. The pride and the astonishment of a parent who has realized their child has exceeded them in a specific and significant capacity, and the particular wonder of it. "She is going to be remarkable," he said. "She already is," Josephine said. They stood at the corral fence together, watching their daughter and the stallion reach an understanding, and Josephine put her arm through Clement's and held on, and he covered her hand with his the way he always did. This was the life they had made. Beginning with a piece of paper and a woman who had prepared for the worst and kept her records and walked 4 miles through pre-dawn mud to stand in a commissioner's office and put the truth on the table. Beginning with a man who had made a mistake and known it, and turned toward the right side of it without calculating the cost first. Beginning with a moment in a cramped courthouse office where 2 people found themselves, unexpectedly and necessarily, standing at the same desk. The eastern parcel remained in Josephine's name, documented in the official county records and in her own parallel ledgers, and in every copy she had made and continued to make, because good habits do not require crisis to justify them. The fence stakes stood straight. The water ran. The cattle moved on good grass. Prentice died in the winter of 1892, which was a loss felt quietly and genuinely by everyone on the ranch. They buried him on the property, which was what he had said he wanted when the subject had come up once, years before, in the way that the subject of burial occasionally came up among people who lived on frontier land. Clement dug the grave himself. Cole said words that were simple and honest and correct. Esteban stood without expression, which was his way of showing what he felt most deeply. Cole took full charge of the range work after that, and managed it with a competence that would have made his uncle proud, which was the best thing that could be said. Josephine and Clement grew older in the way that good people grow older in good lives. Not without difficulty, not without the inevitable erosions of time, but with the sustained engagement of people who remain genuinely interested in the lives they are living and the person they are living beside. He grayed completely by his early 50s, the dark hair going silver and then white, and it suited him with the unhesitating precision of something that was simply correct. She found her first gray strand at 44 and greeted it with equanimity, having never placed much importance on youth as a category and considerably more importance on the accumulation of useful knowledge, which did not arrive until later. They argued sometimes, as people do. Never about the important things, which they had settled between them long ago on the basis of clear evidence and mutual respect. About minor things, the timing of a cattle sale, the repair priorities for the south barn, whether the weather forecast warranted delaying a planned ride. These arguments were efficient and conclusive, each of them too honest to maintain a losing position for the sake of pride. She always won the arguments about records and finances, because her analysis was simply better and they both knew it. He frequently won the arguments about cattle and weather, because his instincts in those areas were the product of decades of specifically calibrated experience. This was a correct distribution of outcomes, and neither of them resented it. Robert married in 1901, a level-headed young woman from Abilene named Susan who arrived in Calla Creek and assessed the Watkins ranch with the calm, thorough attention of someone who had been told what to expect and was confirming it. Josephine approved of her immediately and completely, which Robert had not precisely required but had clearly hoped for. Clara did not marry young. She ran the horse operation that had grown, under her particular gift, into a small but recognized breeding enterprise that sent horses to ranches across the region. She was 25 and still unmarried when Robert's first son arrived, a boy they named Henry, and she held her nephew with the care of someone to whom handling large and sometimes volatile animals had given a profound confidence in the proper management of fragile and precious things. She married at 27, which in 1910 was still considered somewhat later than standard, to a horse buyer named James Reardon, who traveled the region purchasing quality animals, and who had encountered Clara's horses 3 times before he encountered Clara, and had the specific intelligence to recognize, when he met her, that the quality of the breeding operation was fully explained by the quality of the person running it. Josephine met James Reardon and evaluated him with the precision she brought to all important evaluations, and concluded that he was the correct type, honest, curious, able to recognize capability without resenting it. She told Clara this. "I know," Clara said. "I already decided." "I know you already decided," Josephine said. "I am confirming that your decision is well supported by the evidence." Clara smiled at her in the way she had always smiled when her mother said something that was completely practical and completely loving in exactly the same breath. It was 1912 when Josephine sat down at the desk in the ranch house parlor, the same desk where she had always kept her ledgers, the same desk where she and Clement had spent so many evenings working through the accounts and the plans and the ongoing business of a life well organized, and began writing a long letter to the Texas State Land Commissioner's office regarding a pattern of irregularities she had identified in recording practices from 3 neighboring counties. She was 65 years old. Her handwriting was as precise as it had ever been. Clement came in from outside and set his hat on the hook by the door and looked across the room at her bent over the desk in the morning light. And he stood there for a moment in the doorway with the long love of a man who has been looking at the same person for 30 years and finds, consistently, that there is always something more to see. She looked up. He had developed the knack over all those years of standing in a way that she registered without looking, the particular quality of his presence in a room, the specific weight of his attention. "Commissioner," he asked, nodding at the letter. "There is something wrong in the recording practices of 3 neighboring counties," she said. "I have been watching the pattern for 8 months. "Of course you have," he said. "Sit down," she said. "I'll need to think this through with someone." He sat down at the other side of the desk and folded his hands and looked at her with his full attention, as he had always done, as he would always do. She opened her ledger to the relevant section and turned it so he could see. "Start here," she said. "I will explain what I found and you will tell me if my reading of the cattle-related implications is correct." "And if you are already right," he asked, "then you will confirm it and I will proceed," she said. He looked at the ledger with his reading glasses on. He had needed reading glasses for the past 5 years and wore them without complaint, and he looked at the figures she had compiled, and she watched his face move through the recognition of what she was showing him. "Josephine," he said. "I know," she said. "You have been watching this for 8 months. Yes. And you are correct. Yes." He looked up from the ledger at her, and he smiled the smile she knew completely, the one that combined admiration and love in the exact proportions that had not changed in 30 years. "Well," he said, "write the letter. I'll saddle the horses this afternoon and we can ride the eastern parcel and you can think while we ride." She looked at him across the desk. 65 and 67, in the morning light of the ranch house they had built together, on the land she had kept and he had helped her grow. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what we will do." She returned to the letter. He remained at the desk across from her, looking over the ledger figures, occasionally asking a question, the way they had always worked together, in the specific and irreplaceable combination of what each of them was. Outside, the eastern pasture lay green and well-watered in the spring light. The fence stakes stood straight. The cattle moved, and the records, all of them, official and private, original and copied, documented and cross-documented, in Josephine's precise handwriting across 30 years of frontier days, told the true story of this land and these people, as they always had and as they always would. A story that had begun with a widow and a piece of paper and the refusal to be dispossessed, and had become, in its long unfolding, everything that matters. Land that was truly held, work that was honestly done, justice that was quietly and persistently sought, children raised in the knowledge of what their mother and father had built, and what it had cost, and what it was worth. And 2 people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, and had made from that finding, day by careful documented day, the kind of love that does not require a dramatic telling, because it is present in everything. In the supper dishes washed without being asked, in the full attention given to small stories and large problems alike, in the hand taken across the table and held. In the riding together through the long Texas light with nothing needing to be said, because everything important has already been established, in the records kept and the records confirmed, and the truth of a life that stood up to examination from any angle. The truth always stands up. Josephine Yates had known this since before she could remember knowing anything, and she had built her life on it, with her own 2 hands and her own precise mind, and the man who had loved her for both. The letter to the commissioner took 3 drafts and was signed and sealed by mid-morning. Clement had the horses ready by afternoon. They rode out together into the spring light of the eastern pasture, and the meadowlarks were managing their opinions again, and the land was exactly as it had always been hers and theirs and real.